In this video, I've got an iPhone XR that I do a housing swap on. This XR had some internal issues that were mostly caused by some faulty components, and replacing those components is definitely an option, but it was easier just to swap it into a parts housing that I had in place. It just saved a lot of time and effort. So the first thing we got to do is to take the screen off here after removing the pentalobe screws from the bottom. That allows the screen to come apart. And the next thing you have to do is remove the 3 tri-wing screws from the battery connector. The first step with any repair once you get the screen off is to disconnect the battery so you don't fry your board. Once you get the battery disconnected, you can remove 2 more tri-wing screws here. This will disconnect the cables from the LCD screen. There are 2 tri-wing screws. You pull this bracket off and then just take a spudger or your fingernail, pop the 2 connectors out. It's pretty simple stuff, nothing too complex. There's supposed to be a bracket here, but it looks like this phone had been repaired previously and that bracket was missing. The next thing we have to do to pull the board out of this phone to transfer to another is to remove all of the anchor screws. The anchor screws hold the board in place securely so it's not moving around inside the phone. There are a series of anchor screws here that have to be removed. Once you remove all the anchor screws, you can move on to all the flex cables that have to be disconnected. Your rear camera, your front camera, that kind of stuff. Charge port has to be disconnected. And then once all those screws are removed, we can pull the board up and out of this housing here. Now it looks like this phone here had been repaired repeatedly. There's some dent marks on the rear camera. There was a bracket removed. There were some missing screws. So it's a good thing we actually moved this over into a new housing. The housing that I had was from a defective phone. The board was fried on, so we just pulled the board out, and that allowed us to take the board from this phone and put it in that housing because there was nothing wrong with the internal components. It was a much simpler process to do it this way versus replacing those internal components, and it saved a lot of time. All of these flex cables have to be disconnected from the board, and the board really, it's pretty simple. The board just lifts up and out of the old housing. Once this is done, we can move on to the new housing. Another thing that we do have to transfer over is the battery. The easiest way to remove a battery from an iPhone outside of the pull tabs is to use some isopropyl alcohol. Even using pull tabs, it can be a complicated process, and it looked like this battery had been changed before, so we had no real pull tabs to use. The pull tabs were brittle and broken, so we used alcohol to remove that battery. We did want to make sure that we transferred the front camera over to the new housing. You want to make sure you use the original front camera and the original Face ID sensor when you do a housing swap like this. If you don't, you're not going to have Face ID once you're finished with the repair. Once you get the board back into its place before you put the anchor screws in, you want to make sure that all your flex cables line up and snap into place. It's easier to do it before you put the screws in than after. If you put the screws in after, you may have to remove some screws again if the flex cables don't all line up. So you want to make sure that you do it right the first time. It's one of the most time-consuming parts of a repair is trial and error, and if you don't do it right the first time, you have to take stuff apart and put it back together. Once everything is lined up, all your flex cables are snapped back into place, you can start putting your anchor screws back in. The anchor screws, again, will keep your board from sliding around. They hold the board in place, and you want to make sure that all the anchor screws are in their spot and secure nice and tight. This repair looks a lot more complicated than it is. It's actually pretty straightforward. Once your board is back in place, all the anchor screws are back in place, you can start putting your components back in the spots where they go. Now, despite the fact that this rear camera cover had a little dent in it, the rear camera was undamaged and worked just fine. There are 2 screws here at the rear camera that need to be replaced. This little metal clip and its screw also need to be put back into place. And once that's done, we can move on to putting new adhesive down for this battery since the pull tabs were broken. I actually prefer using 3M double-sided adhesive over the pull tabs. It's nice and secure for your battery, but it makes your battery a lot easier to remove if you ever have to pull that battery back out for anything. You want to make sure you test fit your battery to make sure the connector is in place before you actually start finishing up the repair. Once the battery is fit into the proper position, you can start putting your screen back in. I always start with the two LCD connectors at the bottom before I move up to the top where your Face ID sensor and your ear speaker assembly are. Then you just have to replace all your tri-wing screws. There are 2 here for the LCD connector and 3 more for the battery connector. I didn't have any replacement plates for the LCD connectors, so we left that as is for the time being. I did order some of those plates, and I replaced it off camera a few days after this video was recorded. The last 3 tri-wing screws here. This little part is kind of complicated because you have to lift the screen up enough to open up some space to put the screws in, but without damaging those cables. Those cables are easily damaged, so you do have to make sure that you're careful. And now we can line up all the guiding pins along the left and right side of the screen, snap it into place, and replace the 2 pentalobe screws down at the bottom. That's about it when it comes to this part of the repair. We also had to reset the phone because it was disabled. Being disabled is usually caused by a defective screen. It can get damaged, and it starts ghosting and typing in a passcode a bunch of times where it doesn't work. So we did have to put this phone in DFU mode and do a factory reset. This process takes about 20 minutes depending on your internet connection. You press the volume up button, the volume down button, and then the power button. You release the volume up and volume down button as soon as you press them, but then you hold that power button. And then the computer does the rest of the work, and we're finished. I appreciate you guys watching the video. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Y'all take it easy.